Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another edition of Talking Point. We are back in your screens after 2 weeks due to the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. So we say Jazakallah to you, our viewer, for staying with us. I will be in your company for the next 45 to 50 minutes. But I'm not alone. We are going to be joined by someone from Rise Mzanzi. Now, Rise Mzanzi is, of course, a new political party that has entered the landscape and will be contesting next year's general elections. And elections many see as being very important, maybe one that is more as important as the one that was in 1994. Now, that official from Rise Mzanzi is the national spokesperson of the organization, Tebogo Moalusi. Tebogo, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV and on Talking Point.
Good evening, and thank you for having us. Good evening to the viewers, and good evening to yourself.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. Yeah, Tebogo, Rise Mzanzi. It's a political party that's quite a few months old. So you obviously getting into the political sphere of South Africa. But what does Rise Mzanzi bring that would be different from the other political parties that we are seeing within our landscape here?
Thank you for the opportunity. I think it's important to understand the genesis of why we actually have come into existence. We came through a People's Convention that happened in November 2022, and it was a culmination of civil society communities choosing to say that the political establishment that is currently available is not suitable for the conditions. And one of the key mandates that came out of that, we launched in 19 April this year. But what people said to us is we do not want another political opposition. Opposition politics has its place, but what we want is a political alternative. A platform that will craft a new vision that will galvanize South Africans behind a 30-year project. And so what Rise Mzanzi represents is that platform, and hence why you will see we're not prescriptive about the type of politics that we want South Africa to be able to engage in. We are essentially advancing a program to speak widely and broadly to South Africans across the breadth of South Africa to understand what it is they want. I think typically what has happened is, political parties go and define who they are and who they want to be in a corner, and they come and want to force feed that down the throat of citizens and the electorate. We don't want to do that. We want to restore the people's power, and it is about active citizenry and really around flipping the power dynamic where the people are back in power, and politicians and the leaders of government take a mandate from the people, and where they fail to do so, they must be held accountable.
Tebogo, both you and I would agree that in our democracy, and the beauty of it allows there to be various political parties to be in the structure. But would it be a fair assessment to say that South Africa has too many political parties, or is it a necessity to have that to allow the voter that choice beyond obviously, the three big parties or the other parties that obviously represent within the National Assembly?
I think as Rise Mzanzi, our position is we are going through a transition, and transition comes with change and it comes with newness. If you have operated or worked in any industry, let's take fintech or the financial services for that instance, there were kind of the big, institutions that have dominated for centuries. And in kind of an instant, there was a plethora of fintech companies. Now, what tends to happen is you'll always have new entrants who try to take advantage of a gap in the market. And in this instance, there is a gap in the political market. But over time, there becomes a consolidation and a rationalization of those parties or those organizations. So naturally, I think this is what happens in a space of change. And we should welcome it because change will bring with it freshness, newness, new ideas. Because I think we do have a vacuum at the moment. The incumbent really has abdicated their role as being the moral, intellectual center of South African politics, and therefore that's why you see new ideas and political parties coming to the fore. Democracy is about change, it is about options, it's about choice. And I think the choices that are going to come through, including Rise Mzanzi, are about having platforms that are future fit and that are fit for purpose based on the world that we now live in.
You mentioned 30-year project on your T-shirt, of course. 2024 is our in 1994.
Yeah.
And 30 years, we were talking off air just before we started the show, that era of 94 has changed so much. The Thabo Mbeki era had obviously a sense of stability, and then into Polokwane conference of the ANC, and we've just been on that slippery slope for so long. Do South Africans have that patience for 30 years, another 30 years? Because South Africans have been through a lot, and they want to see immediate change. Now, immediate change may not happen today, may not happen tomorrow, it may not even happen in 1 or 2 years' time. But how do we get South Africa back to what it was, the South Africa that we all want, without waiting for 30 years?
I think the first thing is, like you said, 2024 is our 1994. It's realizing that we have a window of opportunity next year. And that window of opportunity is about exercising our right to vote to choose a different future. Now, 30 years looks like a long time if you make the wrong decision. And that's why 2024 is such an inflection point in how we choose and what could be, the journey ahead. If we do not do anything, the cost of doing nothing is that the next 30 years looks like the previous 30 years that we've just experienced. But if we usher in a new, exciting, inspiring type of politics that's backed by a vision and values that bind us together, then 30 years ahead looks like an exciting journey. The young people of this country for far too long have been left outside of the spaces to make decisions about the future they will inherit. I think it's time that we step back and allow young people to make a contribution, a significant contribution. In many spaces in South African life, young people are doing amazing things. You just have to look at the creative industry, in corporate South Africa, in the healthcare industry and so on. In global instances, other countries have got young leaders. It's for South Africa to figure out how do we make sure young people who have fresh ideas can get closer to bringing that innovative energy back into the center of politics and South African life.
You speak about leadership, of course. Songezo Zibi is the leader of Rise Mzanzi. He had that experience, of course, with the Rivonia Circle, and he's quite well versed in politics. Talk to us about his leadership and his ability to galvanize the entire Rise Mzanzi in order to make sure that it fits the vision of where the political party wants to go.
The reality about the South African experience is you always ask someone, what's your story?
Yes.
We are people of many stories. Songezo's story is a beautiful story of many intersections. Having grown up in Mkanduli, which is in the Eastern Cape, his mom had to leave him at a very young age. He was raised by his grandparents, had the opportunity to access education, but then moved into the city and then worked in corporate, worked in civil society, worked as a journalist, as an editor in Business Day. And so all of those intersections give him a very interesting perspective about South African life and what it means to be a South African. I think that's the backstory and the context of his leadership. And what we've tried to do is, whilst he is the national leader, we want to build a leaderful organization. And what you'll see is, there's what we call the National Leadership Collective, which encompasses many different people from different walks of life. We've got civil society, we've got previous politicians, we've got people from business like myself, etc. And it's that collective that we are putting forward as kind of the type of leadership that we want to see. But coming back to your question about Songezo, he's a father of two. Married and lives in Johannesburg, but has worked all over the country. And what that does for I guess his perspective is he has a very good grasp of what it means and feels like to face the challenges that we've faced over the last 29 years. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think there are success stories. Me sitting here is an example of what is possible. But I think we just haven't unlocked our true potential. And I think that's what Songezo represents. A politics and a posture and an identity that joins and unites people, but that is really focused and wants to intentionally shift people and the country forward in a very real and purposeful way.
Tebogo, we're going to continue this conversation after the break. Do stay tuned. I'm talking to Tebogo Moalusi from Rise Mzanzi, a new political party that has entered the sphere of politics within South Africa, and of course their mission and aim heading into next year's elections. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point, Tebogo. I want to talk about obviously the vast array of individuals that are within Rise Mzanzi. You yourself were telling me off air, you've been well traveled in the corporate space. Songezo's been in the corporate space. He's also been, in the media space himself. And then you've got so many group of individuals from different racial backgrounds, from different genders. How important is that within a political movement and a political party like yourself to have these various minds driving forward the agenda and aim of Rise Mzansi?
Diversity is a gift. Actually, in the South African context, diversity is a superpower. The only difference is the current leadership that we have hasn't been able to amplify that and access it. Actually, it's been so fragmented that it's created factions and pushed us apart. What we are trying to do with Rise Mzansi is show the power of our diversity and how being unified can actually take us forward. The concept of diversity and its power is you cannot lead a people that you don't understand. And therefore, having different perspectives in the room allows us to manage and build a social contract and a social compact that's relevant and that is accessible to many people in South Africa. And that's why, those intersections that I spoke about are so fundamental. The color of South Africa in its diversity is also part of the past that we've had. We've had a difficult past, and getting through and breaking through to a point where we can perform is going to have to deal with the healing part of the nation. We can't sweep, the past atrocities under the carpet. The Rainbow Nation, I think, was a novel idea and wanted to bring unity so that we can get on with the business of running a country. But I think part of that project was we forgot about the pain and the trauma that many South Africans faced, and we still have to engage with that. So diversity allows that to happen so that we can then take those conversations as far and wide as possible and really start to see people. In the Zulu a greeting we say sawubona, which means I see you. I think having diversity means you start seeing more people and that you're not in an echo chamber where your own ideas start to become the only way which you think. So that's why we would like to promote diversity in every space that we enter into.
Yeah, and I think it's the same with us in Islam when we say Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, meaning you and I as human beings can interact and find a way forward should challenges, of course, be presented to itself. Tebogo, I want to talk about constituencies because Rise Mzansi, very new. Your aim, obviously one of your aims heading into next year's elections is to try and understand the constituencies, because what we've seen with many of our current leaders is that they've lacked or they've lost touch with the constituencies which they originally had built themselves on. So the importance of Rise Mzansi to get into those constituencies and understand, first of all, who they are and understand what is their needs right now, with so many of these communities lacking the basic needs that they truly deserve.
I'm going to take a step back to 1994, and what the Constitution resembled was a social contract and a psychological contract that South Africans bought into, at least a majority of them. And what we've seen in the last 20 years, and 29 years at least, is so many people sit on the fringes and outside of the benefits of what was promised in that Constitution. And so when people ask us, who do you want to serve? We say, first and foremost, we want to serve those who have not been able to benefit from the fruits and the dividends of our democracy. Otherwise, there's no democracy to speak of. Yes, we have the power of the vote and the opportunity to vote, but on a daily basis, the lived experience of the average South African is a painful one. It's one without food, one with limited access to electricity, poor education, poor healthcare, an unsafe country, etc., etc. That's the description and the life experience of many South Africans, and therefore we all must be committed to making sure that we restore our commitment and our connection with that Constitution. When you talk about the loss of trust with the incumbent and the electorate and the communities, it's a function of a crisis of leadership, a crisis of confidence in democracy, but also a lack of trust in politicians and the political landscape. We see this with just in 2021 how many people went out to vote who are eligible to vote. I think 30% of the electorate were actually participating in the local government elections, which means that up to 70% of the electorate has opted out of politics. Which is not great, because what you need is a healthy democracy where people's voices are heard, where they can exercise their agency. And how we are looking to respond to that is through the People's Manifesto process. We've been, since the 19th of April, we've been going to communities all over the country, across all 9 provinces, really reconnecting with communities to build back that trust. And it's about keeping quiet and asking the question, how do you reimagine South Africa to be? Where have you been failed? And what expectations would you have that would reconnect you to the promise of the Constitution? That's the work we're doing. It's a listening politics, which we haven't seen in a long time. We were talking offline and I was saying the manifesto process of many political parties for the last 29 years has been people go off and they write a document, they get, intellectual minds, and then they go on a roadshow where they tell people what they want. I think we take for granted that people know what they want. We just have to ask them and listen intently, and then build projects and a strategy on how to respond to that. Obviously, there's always going to be a tussle and a battle between priorities, because we're all different. But I think when we go back to the question of who are the most vulnerable, can we prioritize those within the South African experience that sit on the fringes of the benefits of democracy? Then I think it makes sense to start there. We just have to look at how crime affects certain interest groups more than it does others, how lack of economic opportunity keeps certain people outside more than others, and then we must put in place mechanics and programs to try and deal with that. But it's about building a unified South Africa, one which we all buy into, and one which we will love and stay in, so that we can see our children take the baton and grow it after 30 years.
Before we go to the break, Tebogo, proactiveness, because what we've seen in politics so far is reactionary, knee-jerk. It's been the case for so many years, and that in itself shows a lack of urgency from many of our leaders. So how important is it that Mzanzi has that proactive attitude in trying to bring some sort of difference to the people of South Africa?
Reaction and reactivity is a function of a lack of a plan.
Yes.
You are reactive as a function of not having a plan. And South Africa doesn't have a plan. And where we've had a plan, we have not been able to commit to it, and there hasn't been consequence to our inability to work against that plan. The National Development Plan, we are 7 years from looking at whether or not we've delivered. Now, if you look at some of the touch points and the KPIs of that plan, it talks about a 5.4 economic growth, GDP growth year on year. For last quarter, I think we were in negative 0.4. I think it's only this year that we've seen maybe a 0.2% growth in GDP. Compare that to 5.4. Now, in any self-respecting organization, whether it's a media house, whether it is a bank, or whether it's any organization, when you fail to reach your targets by that extent continuously over a 29-year period, there would be consequences. You would be fired, you'd be let go of, or you would exit and humbly say, I cannot do this job. That's what 2024 is about. It's about us saying, we had a plan. This plan was set by you guys. You decided this plan, and you failed against your own plan. So if you don't bow out, we must vote differently and bring in a new group of leaders who will bring a new plan, so that we are not reactive. We are proactive, and we are inspired as a people, and we are restoring hope so that people can walk the journey with us.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Tebogo Moalusi from Rise Mzanzi. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Back to Talking Point. I'm still in conversation with Tebogo Moalusi from Rise Mzanzi. Tebogo, let's talk leadership. Again, off air, we were talking about just such a void of leadership that we lack within South Africa. Servant leadership, it's not there anymore. When the politicians walk through the door, it's like we stand up and we look at them as some sort of savior for our country. We have a crisis in leadership, don't we?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think of all the issues that we have, a crisis in leadership is probably at the top of the list. Because what leadership does, it creates the culture, and by culture we mean the collective behavior of people, that allows us to then show up differently every single day. And we've seen it with many countries, companies, organizations. The presence of great leaders changes the posture of a company's performance. And, you know, South Africa has performed so badly in leadership that people have become completely disillusioned. We don't even, it's not even just about how bad things are. We've lost hope in the current government's ability to respond positively to challenges. You know, we are faced with a massive crime and safety issue right now. People just don't fathom and believe they can ever live in a safe country ever again. But that is because they are disillusioned based on a leadership that has not cared about safety. Safety for Rise Mzanzi is probably the second after leadership most important thing that we need to solve for. Because when people are not safe, they cannot be creative, they cannot innovate, they cannot be hopeful, they cannot invest themselves in a future because they don't see themselves in that future. The issue of drug abuse comes up so many times across all the town halls that we've been to, Mdantsane, Khayelitsha, Umlazi, Soweto, Soshanguve, you name it. The first thing they raise is the drug problem because it has decimated community and family life. And it is so difficult to deal with because the perpetrators and the victims of drug abuse live within the community. And therefore it's difficult to deal with it as a criminal issue. We actually, as Rise Mzanzi, have postured a hypothesis that drugs in South Africa are a mental and healthcare issue and not a crime issue. Dealing with it as a crime is after the fact. We should be dealing with it from a causal point of view and understanding what has broken. It's leadership. If we had the right leaders in place, if we had the best who can lead, we would have programs and activities that respond to some of the challenges that we face.
Tebogo, the voter, because you mentioned earlier on in the previous segment that many of the South African voters shy away from going to the polls because they believe that why am I voting? It makes no real difference. There has to be a change in terms of that mentality, hasn't there? Because without that, there can't be the change that the citizen needs. And that's why 2024 has to be so important, isn't it? That they need to get to the polls to make that difference, because without that, then there's nothing for you to complain about.
I think it's two things that we have to look at. I think the first thing is we do have to do a bit of work of re-earning the trust. I think citizens are in their right to feel disillusioned because they've been let down. Yes. You know, it's a human response when day in, day out, people come make promises, they leave, they forget you, and so on. And therefore, what's going to be important is how does Rise Mzansi build a sense of confidence that we're going to be different. And that's why using listening politics has been one of the ways that we want to differentiate how we want to show up in the political realm. You know, the second thing is the electorate and citizens must ask themselves, what's the cost of doing nothing? We have seen over the elections a declining trend of voter turnout. What we've also seen in correlation to that is a decline of the conditions under which South Africans are living. And so whilst we remain with the power of the vote and do not exercise that vote, what has happened is the quality of South African life has deteriorated. What we then say as a hypothesis is that if we continue to go down that road, we will have a country that we cannot save because we haven't taken the choice to then make the change that will change the trajectory of South Africa. And therefore, that's why whilst it is important for us to earn the trust of the South Africans, it's also important for South Africans to realize that we are at a crossing point here. If we do not act now in 2024, the next time we can have our voice heard is 2029.
Nobody wants to wait till then.
How long?
Yeah,
do you know how bad things can get in a year? How bad things can get in 2 years? COVID was 2 years.
Yes.
So to our viewers at home, ask yourself, how bad can things get in 5 years? What country will you and your children inherit in 2029 with the current political climate running your life the way that it is? Many of us work. We pay VAT at 15%. Some people pay all the way up to 45% of their earned income to tax. That's not going to change. That money that you pay on a monthly basis gets misused by corrupt, criminal, syndicate politicians because you're not saying you want different.
Yes.
Make sure your 45%, 41%, 30%, 15% counts. And the way to do that is to vote, to be an active citizen, and then to start holding leadership accountable.
They were talking about those politicians. I want to touch on corruption. The State Capture Commission report, obviously it's a recommendation. 2 weeks ago we have Chief Justice Raymond Zondo saying, well, maybe Parliament needs to establish its own inquiry into getting those who have been mentioned in the report to be charged or to be held accountable. And I just think to myself, and what was the point of this commission? Because people are frustrated. And here I present the question to you. Should citizens be actually taking this report seriously? Because they thought, we have this commission, let's prosecute those who have been involved in state capture, but nothing has been done.
Nothing has been done because there isn't the political will to do that. And also those who have been implicated are complicit in making the decisions of what happens with that report. You know, you just have to look at some of the officials within the top 6 of the ANC and how many of them were named in that report. What has been done? You know, some of them hold high positions in government. Any leader of government, any president who is serious about dealing with corruption in the way that President Cyril Ramaphosa said in his Tumamina campaign would have stepped up to the plate. But we're now seeing that he's no different, irrespective to the gravitas that came with him coming in and say, I'm going to be a new broom that sweeps clean. We now see through Phala Phala and through all of these other examples that he's no different, and therefore what we have is a crisis of politics. The structure and culture of politics in South Africa is broken. And that's why, as Rise Mzanzi, we talk about the Great Reset. You know, we must demand for a new type of politics that brings new leaders onto the fore. Judge Zondo is in his right to want to push for action to be taken. You know, the Zondo Commission cost north of 800 million rand. 800 million rand of your money, South Africans, was used over a 4-year period to try and get to some kind of conclusion around what's happening with state funds, corruption, and so on. It's high time that as South Africans we use all instruments available to us to hold people accountable. Part of that is the vote, absolutely. Part of that is putting pressure on government and other arms of state to make sure that that report gets taken forward. And where we fail to do so, we must then think about what other reforms we need to put in place in order to start protecting ourselves against commissions that don't yield any outcomes.
Tebogo, before we go to the break, political reform is needed in South Africa. I think both you and I can agree on that. But how do we get to a point where individualism is not trumped ahead of the interests of the people? Because it's clear that many within the ruling party, it's protecting the party and protecting themselves rather than the interests of the people. It's quite clear for everyone to see. So how can political reform allow for people first, people second, people third?
All power to the people.
Yeah.
Political reform is part of what we have put forward as one of our key priorities, and it is in the form of electoral reform. Electoral reform is saying, how do we go to constituency-based elections and constituency-based democracy? You should be able to know which parliamentarian serves you in government, and you should have the power to be able to do a performance appraisal on their work, and where they fail, you should be able to have a say whether they stay or not. At the moment, there's a conference that happens, people get nominated into positions, they get put into government, and we are only able to hold them accountable on a 5-year cycle. That cannot work. We must be able to hold people accountable at very least on an annual basis and be able to remove people from power. The second thing is, I think it's important that people start owning and leading within their communities. South Africa is a vast and a very big country, but we all live and come from a community. And part of Rise Mzanzi's politics is how do we strengthen community networks and communities as platforms for real leadership, where you can start affecting your quality of life based on the space in which you reside, and how we then connect those communities. And some of them are geographical, where you live, but some of them cut across, where you work, where do you go and worship, where do you, go in and build family life. And so those intersections are also fundamental. We must activate the people's inner leadership,
Yes.
Within the home, within the family, within every space that we find in South African life. We must allow and make sure that South Africans lead themselves before they outsource their leaderships to a government.
Yes, brilliant point brought there, of course, leading from yourself instead of, as Tebogo would mention, outsourcing your leadership, because you, the person of the community, will understand your community even better. After the break, I wrap up my conversation with Tebogo Moalusi from Rise Mzanzi. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're in the final minutes of our conversation here with Tebogo Moalusi from Rise Mzanzi. Tebogo, I want to talk about coalition politics. In many of the metros, it's just been a headache, a disaster. It just doesn't seem to be working for the people. Can it still be trusted, given everything that has happened? And if we look at the electorate, and this is just predictions going forward, South Africa may enter into a national coalition government. Can citizens trust it, given what's happening in our metros?
It's difficult for citizens to feel like they can, but that I think is because the current politics is premised around power and procurement.
Yes.
If we were to reform the way power is shared and reform the way we procure, I think we would deal with a significant number of the issues that we see. The incumbents at the moment, I think, are jostling for power within the various metros, because power means access. And access then means more power.
Yes.
And that's the kind of politics that we're seeing play out. But I think we have an opportunity to change that. And the way we change that is by seeing a reconfiguration of what type of coalitions we want to see. We should work to remove power out of what has been traditional politics. It's not just about the ANC, by the way. It is about even the opposition, because the opposition is part of what we are seeing. This 29 years of ineffective government has not been happening in the absence of the current opposition. And therefore, we must look at the establishment, the current political establishment, to include the current opposition. And that's why we're positioning ourselves as an alternative. What new type of politics do we want to see that removes itself away from the politics of power and the politics of procurement? And that, I think, is what South Africans should be looking forward to. Coalition politics are definitely going to be a part of South African life. Yes. We cannot get away from it. But I think the question our viewers should be thinking about is, what are the values? What are the values we want coalitions to subscribe to? What are the non-negotiables? You can negotiate within the chambers of government around, how programs are run, but what are non-negotiables? And that's what the electorate should be looking for in the posture of the political parties they will engage with, and in the programs and the policies and the priorities that the different parties will be putting forward. Our values are simple. There's 5 of them. Number 1 is justice. I don't think you can live in South Africa and understand our context without having justice at the forefront of dealing with the challenges that we face. Number 2, freedom. Freedom is a very important part of South Africa's experience, and it's important for, just from a human point of view, that we're able to unlock and enable people to exercise the freedoms that are protected within the Constitution. Number 3 is equality. There's so many disparities across different intersections, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, where you live, your class, even just your proximity to office. We need to deal with equality as an important value. Number 4 is solidarity. I spoke about being united, being a key part of how we unlock the value of our diversity. Solidarity must be about, when someone that I care about is not doing well, what am I doing to show up for them? It's not just about me. Too many of us sit behind gated communities, We send our kids to private schools, we have private healthcare, and therefore it's not my problem.
Yes.
But it is your problem. Because when you get out of that gated community, you're part of the world, you're part of South Africa. And load shedding showed that to us. It was almost that it democratized pain and made us realize that even in a gated community, you can suffer from stage 6. So let's be reminded of that. And the last one is integrity, which speaks to the leadership question. Can we have the best to lead? Because it's the best to lead that are going to accelerate us into a place of where all of those other 4 values can be realized. That and those should be the values that govern a coalition. And when people behave outside of that, then there should be consequence.
Tebogo, the Moonshot Pact. I want to bring that into the discussion. Obviously, it's something that has been established, but it's going to be taken forward next month in Kempton Park. So, obviously, the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, the IFP, part of those that are going to be there. Would that appeal Rise Mzanzi, or would there need to be a thorough analysis of whether you guys would want to join this Moonshot Pact?
I think there's 2 key points there. The first is we realize that coalition politics is important, and we will definitely participate. We just feel that it's premature.
Yes.
There hasn't been a basis for what a coalition and what should inform the coalition. What are the rules of the game, and what are the values that should bind us together? Having an anti-position is not enough to put people together. I mean, to say we don't want the ANC and we don't want the EFF, and that's enough to define the basis of our relationship, for us is not something that's attractive. Secondly, it would be to define what's the plan, what's the vision that brings us together, and how do our various positions align us to that plan. So if you look at even the spectrum of the parties that sit within the coalition, if you think around very key ideas, for example, around the death penalty, if you're going to run an economy and run a social justice and criminal justice program, but you've got political parties that have got disparate understandings of capital punishment, it's going to be difficult to find a common place, If you think about the right to choice of life and termination of pregnancy and abortion, these are very important ideas that affect people's rights. And if you have very, split positions, having an anti-ANC and anti-EFF position does not allow you to, come together based on those issues. Definitely. Immigration, another massive one. If immigration is, left on the one side and right on the other side, having an anti-ANC and anti-EFF position does not bring you closer together. We are more interested in having a conversation, a deep conversation about what's going to be the basis that brings us together to serve South Africans.
Yes.
How do we prioritize South Africans first? Not about how do we try to amass power so that we can make the other person look ridiculous. That is what we think about coalitions. At a stage where we are comfortable and when we've canvassed the country wide enough, we will have answers and inputs from people who will say, this is the type of coalition politics that we want to see. And that is the posture that we will present.
To wrap up the conversation, Tebogo, we're still a long way away from the 2024 elections, but of course, political parties like yourself and many others are laying the groundwork for there to be the campaigning. What would you say is the short-term plan for Rise Mzanzi, and of course, looking long-term?
Short-term plan is we're holding a series of policy conventions and roundtables where we are soliciting ideas. Part of, I think, the challenge we've had is there's too few amazing minds defining the program of government. Amazing people from all walks of life. We need to crowdsource South Africans' brilliance. And that's what our policies process is about. So there'll be a series of those. In September, we want to host our People's Manifesto Convention, which essentially will bring all the inputs that we've been getting from the different town halls, the policy sessions, to bring them together. And what will then come out of that is the People's Manifesto. It is that will then define the conversations that we want to then have with South Africans, because it will be informed by South Africans. The remainder of the year will be about serving communities. Micro actions and doing work in communities is absolutely important to us. Elections are important. Yes. And irrespective of the outcomes of the polls of 2024, Rise Mzansi will continue to work in communities to build them up. We're not an electoral machine.
Yes.
We are a platform to change South Africans' lives. And therefore, if we focus too much on elections, we lose the opportunity on a daily basis to change people's quality of life. You know, as you said earlier on, those who live in those communities are best positions to define the challenges and come up with some of the solutions. How do we band together and come up with micro actions that deal with some of the challenges that we face on a daily basis? Obviously, there's big issues like load shedding, etc., etc. But community policing forums, food schemes, clothes schemes, working with schools to improve quality of education and safety within schools, making the girl child seen and protected through dealing with issues of menstruation and poverty in that space. How do we build a life of dignity for those people who just on a constant daily basis sit on the fringes of benefiting from what we fought for in 94? So that's what we'll be obsessed with. Every now and then we'll take a moment to rest because we all come from families as well. And it doesn't make sense pouring from an empty cup. It's important that we take time to reflect, to think, to connect, to build our spiritual fitness. So that's also part of the journey of leadership. So yeah, that's a program for at least the remainder of the year. And then we'll ramp up towards 2024 to prepare for the elections.
Tebogo, I wish we had more time to have further this conversation, but I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us and visiting us here at Hilaal TV in our studios, and for being a guest on Talking Point, and all the best going forward for Rise Mzanzi.
Thank you, Hilaal TV. Thank you to the viewers. We really appreciate the platform, and we look forward to engaging with you further.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. We are definitely looking forward to that. That's Tebogo Moalusi. He's the national spokesperson for Rise Mzanzi. Of course, a new political party looking to make an impact ahead of next year's polls. That's all we have for you here on Talking Point. We'll see you again same time, same place. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.